Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Modern Meathead Experience. This week, we have something a little bit different. The section that you are listening to or viewing right now is just the introduction. And this week, I'm actually reposting a podcast that I recorded with a guy. His name is Rich or Richard. And I was a guest on his podcast. And I think that overall, it was a really, really good conversation. I thought it was interesting. We expanded upon a lot of different topics, an hour, close to an hour and a half of content. And so I thought I'd repost it here just because I liked it as a conversation and I think that it's valuable. So, just as an introduction, I wanted to say that number one. So, special shout out to Rich. I'll put Rich's podcast link in the description. I think he has a great podcast with a lot of good questions, a lot of valuable information there. And I just want to kind of lay out an outline for what we talked about before we jump into things. So, overall, we talked a lot about lifting technique, so addressing certain kinds of questions like, how important is it when it comes to building muscle? Is it more important than we once thought? Is it less important? Are there good or bad ways to lift? And so on and so forth. So, within a sort of subsection of that discussion, we talked about, over focusing on technique, under focusing on technique, the balance of creating effort and prioritizing effort and hard work as compared to technique, the sort of false dichotomies that come along with that, whole conversation. And then just sort of, the process through which we can work someone or train someone when it comes to contextualizing technique. So, point being, a lot of stuff on technique, at least initially. Then we sort of moved on to talk more about muscle growth specifically, not necessarily from a mechanistic perspective, right? But just sort of broadly speaking, what makes an exercise effective from a muscle growth and strength standpoint? What are the sort of component parts? What are the pieces to the puzzle that sort of compose a useful exercise selection? We discussed other things such as the importance of standardization when it comes to building muscle. We talked about concepts like range of motion and how much we move during given reps, and for what goals more range is more appropriate, and for what goals less range is more appropriate. Just sort of some myth busting relationship to that. And then we sort of finished off with some discussion around social media, some of the flaws with social media, some of the benefits of social media, and then some additional topics, such as, topics that sort of span off of that initial technique conversation around trying to make predictions of around injury and things related to the discussion of technique and injury. So, Rich, again, thank you for having me on. I hope you all enjoy the conversation, and I'll see you all next week.
First of all, do you want to sort of introduce yourself, go into a bit about who you are, who you help, what you do?
Yeah. So my name is Ben Giannis. Many people think it's Yanes.
Oh, no way. I thought it was
Yeah.
James.
Yeah. You and everyone else, it's okay.
Wow. I
So yeah,
learned
Ben
something new today.
Giannis. Yeah, there you
Giannis.
go. And I was originally a personal trainer. Um, did that for years, and I sort of entered it through the strength and conditioning world. So when I was in college, I was, training athletes of all different kinds: basketball, football, American football, soccer. The whole works. And I transitioned away from athletic training pretty quickly when I realized that a lot of people who were in athletic training didn't love to do what I love to do, which was to lift weights. I worked with powerlifters for a long time. I was, a sort of informal powerlifter myself. So that's kind of how I entered the fitness realm. Actually, my first entryway was actually technically CrossFit, which,
Oh.
I've been ashamed to admit in the past. I'm now no longer ashamed of it. I accept it as reality. And yeah, after that, when I moved, basically, or when I finished college and when I moved into the city, I was personal training for a couple years. And over the course of that entire length of time, it's all sort of a
a mess in my head to some degree now in terms of like when which things were happening and when I was doing what. But I was always sort of studying anatomy and biomechanics and physics sort of underneath of the hood. I remember buying my first anatomy textbook when I was like 14, off of Amazon. It was like $15. I don't even remember the name of the book, but I always was interested in anatomy at least. And so that's something that I've sort of studied on and off for a very long time, going on a decade now. But I think I would say over the last 5 years or so, I've really, really dug deep into the nitty gritty of specifically how anatomy applies to, or really knowledge of anatomy applies to weight room training. Because I think that, a lot of people learn a lot of stuff about anatomy in formal education. And even in settings that are sort of advertised to be exercise science-based degrees, there's actually very little application between the theory and practice. And so that sort of gap between theory and practice is really what I've focused on the last couple years, really the last year and a half specifically, where I've put all of my focus into helping just normal meatheads and mostly personal trainers alike to sort of better their understanding of anatomy and physics and biomechanics in an attempt to better train their clients or better train themselves. And so much of my work is related to generalized content. But I also do, things on the side, consulting, the occasional session still just to help coaches in my area. And that's kind of the shtick from start to finish. And that's where I'm currently at.
Biomechanics and exercise mechanics are something I need to, or I really want to improve on. And it's something that I think a lot of coaches fail to study. How important do you think it is when it comes to being a top coach, personal trainer, to have some pretty decent knowledge of biomechanics and exercise mechanics?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question because I think the common assumption is that it's kind of this thing that should be considered as an afterthought, right? In the personal training industry, you know, you can pass a weekend certification and be technically qualified to train, my 88-year-old grandmother who has, knee arthritis and all different kinds of, structural issues. Like there's very little barrier to entry in the personal training space specifically. And, it's like, how do you kind of navigate that? Well, other than trying to basically turn personal training into like physical therapy school, like you go through several years of education that way, I don't really see that changing, at least not in the near future. But to kind of answer the question specifically, I think that understanding mechanics, and I sort of understand mechanics as really being the combination of a knowledge of anatomy and a knowledge of physics, right? The kind of the collection of those two things as it relates to exercises, where mechanics ends up being the sort of outcome of those two things. And I think that in order to study mechanics and to know mechanics, you need to invest, a ton of time and a ton of effort into those two areas. And that's not something that is flashy or fun or sexy, but I think it's as important to personal trainers, if not maybe more important to trainers in some ways, in relationship to like a physical therapist or a doctor. That obviously a doctor who's maybe an orthopedic surgeon needs to know anatomy better than like anyone else on the planet, right? You literally have a life in front of you that's at stake. And I just view personal training as a very, very, very scaled back version of like the orthopedic surgeon who is operating on a person, right? To some degree, both of those things are actually similar in terms of their quality. Just in terms of the magnitude of effect, there's a large difference, right? So the person who's operating on someone has a direct influence on what happens to their body. And the person who is training other people has a direct influence on what happens to their clients or their own bodies. And I think that, a large part of the fitness space is composed of people who are, sort of, we'll say 30, 35 years or younger. Really between 20 and 30 is like where a lot of people, at least posting content, tend to be. Nothing against anyone younger or older or anything like that. But those are people who very often see very little consequence for doing really dumb stuff. And so I think there's this notion that like our bodies are incredibly resilient with no capacity for degradation or no capacity for injury. And when you do get injured, it's like you recover, it's not a big deal. And I'm not one to sort of fear monger and say that like we're fragile as humans. We're certainly not fragile. We've evolved not to be. But at the same time, if you're a trainer, I think you have a moral obligation to dive into this stuff, because it's like those are the ingredients that you're kind of cooking with. You know, imagine a chef in a 5-star restaurant having no idea what salt is. It's like, you know, it's like this is a major ingredient in a food that someone is going to be tasting. And so, you know, in the same way that I think a chef should understand sort of what needs to go into meals and how to construct meals, I do think that a personal trainer needs to at least understand some amount of anatomy and some amount of physics to be able to actually, you know, appropriately coach. And that doesn't mean that you have to have a freaking PhD. And there are plenty of PhDs, by the way, that have no idea what they're doing from an exercise mechanics perspective either, right? But you don't need to be spending 10 hours a day studying to, I think, reach a substantial level of competency in sort of all those domains. So that's kind of where I currently sit. It's definitely changed over time, but I do think that it's of utmost importance. And obviously, I do have a little bit of bias toward believing that and thinking that, but I think it's a reasonable claim to make.
I have got your course, by the way. I have started it.
Excellent.
Yeah. It's I find it difficult. The whole thing, I find it very challenging. I only just started sort of dipping my toe into biomechanics and exercise mechanics during COVID. And that's when I sort of got my sort of foot in the door with it, and I thought, oh, this is complicated. This is completely new, and it's something I want to really try and improve on. So just for people who don't understand, because I'm trying to make it as least complicated as possible, what is the difference between biomechanics and exercise mechanics?
Yeah. So biomechanics is really specific to and describes a field of research around how humans move. So I once heard one of the guys I've studied a lot or listened to a lot. He's a PhD in biomechanics. He actually calls biomechanics necromechanics. And for those of you who don't know, necro, the prefix basically means dead or related to death. So what he meant in essence by that is we call it biomechanics, like bio meaning like life, but most of the knowledge that we have about anatomy comes from studying dead people, right? It comes from studying cadavers. So biomechanics is much more related to the specific field of study that is based around analyzing dead people and their structure and their structural abnormalities. And it's mostly, at least in application to, you know, that sort of academic field specifically, biomechanics is mostly used to inform therapists, right? People who are doctors, maybe who are doing surgeries, like, you know, orthopedic surgeons. That's most of what biomechanics is actually dedicated to. So it's a little bit of a misnomer, and it's a very good question and a good distinction to make, because exercise mechanics is not technically biomechanics, right? It's like biomechanics is a part. You could consider biomechanics to be a sort of category that is related to exercise mechanics, but exercise mechanics is essentially the study of motion or the study of forces within the context of a specific skill or a specific activity, right? And so exercise mechanics don't just apply to lifting weights, right? Because everyone in the exercise worlds or the exercise world thinks of exercise as lifting, but exercise to the normal person could be hiking, it could be kayaking, it could be running, it could be jogging, whatever. And so exercise mechanics is more so just a broad field of study that analyzes a particular form of exercise and says, hey, here are the components of it related to physics and related to anatomy. And again, that's kind of how I like to think about it, is when we're talking about biomechanics, quote unquote, biomechanics in the context of exercise, we're really just talking about how physics and anatomy interact with one another to create what we call exercise.
Let's move on to sort of muscle growth. Obviously, when it comes to muscle growth, we will be moving load in a gym. Obviously, good technique and moving a load from A to B involves technique and exercise mechanics. So in your opinion, what's the importance of technique when it comes to building muscle? Is it important? Is it not?
So Also, if at any point you see me looking down, it's because I have a notepad and I'm writing things.
No worries.
So you know I'm not off tasking. Okay. I know
No,
that
that's all good.
some guests I've seen off task on their phones during podcasts. I'm just like,
Really?
what the yeah, it's a despicable practice, but
Yeah,
anyhow.
kind of rude.
Yeah, pretty rude. So a couple of things to understand here. The first is that it's an interesting question in terms of the framing, but I think that the frame of the question should be first broken apart, right? Because usually these kinds of discussions go in the direction of like, well, is it important or is it not important? Or is it good or is it bad? And so, just sort of outright, I think whenever we're thinking about these kinds of things, it's important to clear the frame of the question first and identify the frame of the question. And it might seem sort of pedantic and annoying, but I actually think that it's the most important thing that needs to be discussed first before anything more intricate is or specific is talked about. So when we say like, is it important or not important? I just don't accept the frame that it's either one of those things, right? Like clearly there's a spectrum or a gradient of importance, and how much a given technique will matter is really specific to the given context that we're looking at, right? So for example, if you're an Olympic weightlifter competing at the highest level, technique and the practice and the rehearsal of technique is pretty much like the thing that everyone is talking about constantly and that needs to be optimized for at every single moment of every single training session. But for the average person that is, walking into the gym, your average PT client, like that person does not need the same level of precision in their technique because their goals are far more generalized, right? So speaking to the context of like general training for muscle growth and muscle hypertrophy, I look at technique as sort of this thing that creates a roadmap to guide us in making decisions. And so what technique that you use and how specific you are with technique, to me, always just comes back to what is the goal of the exercise and why am I doing this to begin with. So for example, would it be good technique? It sounds kind of silly, but would it be good technique if my goal was to train my quads to perform biceps curls? Like, would that be a good technique to train my quads? No, everyone would think that was stupid, right? But now if you sort of narrow in on the scope of like quad training specifically, we can start to now identify like, okay, I'm training my quads. A leg extension is probably not a bad idea to train my quads. And now within the context of the leg extension, we can start to talk about what are the first principles of a leg extension that I should understand to do this thing that in a way in which would make sense to train my quads, right? No one would get on a leg extension backwards. Hopefully, no one would to train their quads. No one would align their knee on the leg extension sideways, right? So clearly there is a reasonable window within the framework of every exercise within which we can say this is a solid technique for this goal. But without a reference to a goal and without an identification of what we're trying to do with something, we can't really start backwards, right? And then work forwards. We have to start from the goal and then sort of descend outward from there. So in general, technique is important, but it's important to always contextualize exactly what you're trying to do, right? That example of the Olympic weightlifter versus grandma walking into the gym, right? It's important to just sort of define that context first. And then within that context, we can start to talk about the sort of reasonable window of technique that we find appropriate. And then the reasonable window of, or really the unreasonable window of technique, which we find would be inappropriate for a particular goal, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I think when someone says technique, in my eyes, it's the quality of the rep, right? The quality of how you move a load from A to B, but also it can be, I don't know, the range of movement. It could be, I don't know, it could be the control of the rep, right? I know it's a very, very broad question, but that's why I thought it'd be good to kind of speak about, because it's a subject which is very common nowadays on social media. In the gym, technique is a very talked about subject. So do you think, again, this is coming on to my second question, do you think there's a risk of people focusing way too much on technique, on the quality of the rep, so it's almost taken away the importance of taking a working set close to failure and actually getting to the effective rep stage of a set. Do you think that's an issue?
Yeah, it's definitely an issue that I think, because and social media will continue to come up, I think, throughout this conversation, just because it's such a strong influence on the way that we think and the way that we conceptualize these things. And I think that when we consume this information on social media, we're often led to believe that like there are these two polar extremes of people, right? And there's the kind of person maybe that you're describing, which is the person that sort of misses the forest for a single tree of like, is my arm path in the perfect position? Am I perfectly using a 2-1-0 tempo? Am I, stopping and starting at the right places? And then on the other end of the extreme, right? And assume that person A, right? Person A who is hyper focusing on technique and the qualities of technique is using 50% of the load that they theoretically could for a given number of reps, right? That's probably not the best situation, at least relative to the average person who's looking to grow muscle. But then there's the other end of the extreme, who is like the traditional bro, like it doesn't matter what you do, just train hard, bro, do the basics, bro, use more weight, bro. There's that person who pays no mind to really how they're doing things, and both of those people suffer consequences, but those consequences are just different and the trade-offs are different, right? So it seems obvious to me that the relatively most effective place to be is somewhere in between those two things, where you're not neglecting training hard, but while simultaneously you're also, at least like we just talked about, you're working within the reasonable window of technique, which is appropriate from a qualitative perspective, given the context of a particular goal. So I think that if you find yourself on either end of the spectrum, and I see plenty of examples of just in my daily life, going to the gym that I go to, traveling to gyms that I go to, of both kinds of people. I see it constantly. But I do think that on social media, I think would lead you to believe that it's likely more of an issue than it actually is. I think a lot of people are still getting results, depending on how you qualify or quantify results, right? That the end goal sort of being to grow muscle. A lot of people can grow muscle doing either thing, but it tends to be the case that the person focusing, we'll go with person A, the person A who is hyper focused on technique, sacrificing effort, that person is maybe running into issues with actually growing tissue, right? And then the person B, who's not focused on that at all, is probably growing a substantial amount of tissue, right? Assuming they're doing the other things, nutrition, sleep, etc. But maybe they're running into injuries, maybe they're running into discomforts, maybe they're running into certain muscle groups growing and other muscle groups aren't growing, right? So that is kind of why, I guess coined this term, the modern meathead, right? Because the modern meathead is the person that really acknowledges both sides of that spectrum as being important from a principle-based standpoint, but that is able to integrate those two things, understanding that they are not mutually exclusive, right? I think the ideal scenario is to be able to take the lessons from both kinds of people and to be able to sort of appropriately balance those two things in our quest, right, to gain muscle. And I do think it's interesting because, again, it's almost like we have these two opposite ends of the extreme, and a lot of times it seems that we aren't acknowledging that both sides have valid points to make. It's kind of like, you're either one person or you're the other, and you're either stupid or you're either smart, right? When in reality, I think most of it ends up being a sort of gray area. And which of those two things you need to focus more on will always depend on like where someone is currently at and what direction you sort of need to push them in. Because I've had both kinds of clients, the person that needs to unlearn their stupid habits and the person that needs to actually let go of some amount of that control over technique and those kinds of things. So it's a really interesting, balance to try to strike. And I don't think that there is a simple answer. I just think that it mostly needs to come down, much like in the technique conversation, to like what is the individual person struggling with, and what is a sensible direction to sort of take this person as a consequence of that.
Because you could have someone who is not even thinking about technique, and their main goal is to push or pull a weight from A to B as hard as possible, take their working set close to failure. And yes, they'll get some growth from that. But then, like you say, that's one extreme. If you sort of push that into the sort of gray area, they get far better results when they start to incorporate better technique. I guess as well, that's why it's so important to really try and nail technique for someone who is a beginner, in the weights room when they first start training, so they can start to build these habits up. Once they start to get really heavy, they start to really push their working sets into near failure, their technique will start to break down. If they build the habits, from the ground up, then that's less likely to happen, isn't it?
Yeah, I would think so, and like I said, I do think it's not necessarily a simple thing to be able to guide someone in that regard. I think that it's something that as a trainer or coach, you have to have real experience to sort of understand. And I do think that a lot of the commentary that we see on social media comes from people that do not have real experience working with real human beings. And so all of their opinions are kind of just based off of their own experiences and what they've had success and what they haven't with. And so I think that, in the context, let's say like, I had a client this one time who had literally never lifted weights in his life before. And, he was like 21, 22 years old at the time. So, a relatively like healthy, young individual by all standards. And there were times where I would need to really get him on certain motions to focus on slowing down, being more controlled, those kinds of things. But then in the context of other motions, I needed to get him to focus a little bit just purely more on effort and more on just, pulling the thing to pull the thing or pushing the thing to push the thing. So it's not even like specific to a person, right? It's almost even more specific than that. It's contextual to each motion that the person is doing, right? Because on certain motions, they may apply certain techniques given their fear around the movement, right? You cannot say that something like, an 8-rep max hack squat is going to feel the same as like an 8-rep max biceps curl. Like those are two very different experiences. So it's interesting because even within the context of a single person, that single person may actually apply different strategies to different motions, depending on how they relate to that motion. And then also depending on what their history with that kind of thing actually is. A lot of people, when they feel a heavy weight applied on their shoulders, that's like a much more intimidating, sort of scary thing. Whereas, picking up a weight and doing curls, it's like, curls for the girls, right? It's like it's something fun to do. It's exciting. And so those are two very different scenarios. So, all of this stuff is super difficult to talk about generally, because there are so many different cases that arise. But I do think that the more that we can operate sort of off of these not so black and white ideas, and the more that we can at least think principally and think in the gray area, the more that we can just look at any context as just this is the context in and of itself, and the more that we are hesitant, I think, to generalize these things, because generalizing things is necessary. Like we're generalizing all the time when we talk, but to actually hone in and to get anything out of these conversations, we do eventually need to be more practical and name specific scenarios in which there may be exceptions or there may be different things that we need to sort of apply and think about.
What you just said about gray area and the general answer of it depends, it comes across so much in this industry, doesn't it? There's no black and white. It's always a gray area. So what do you think makes an exercise effective for muscle growth?
Yeah, so I kind of have two answers, mainly, one of which is going to be people are going to find more annoying, and then one of which will be more practical, and there can be some practical takeaways to it. So the first thing is that how effective a particular exercise is for a specific goal is going to depend on where that person is currently at. So for example, you take the absolute noob to the weight room, right? They can basically walk into the weight room and look at a pair of dumbbells and grow muscle looking at a pair of dumbbells, right? But the person who is competing at the IFBB level and has been training for 2 decades, they're going to shrink if they go into the gym and look at dumbbells, right? And kind of a, I'm obviously being hyperbolic, but you kind of get the point, right? Where one person may be able to grow muscle now, grow muscle in a year, grow muscle in 2 years, doing things that the world may look at as totally unspecific, totally suboptimal, right? To use that sort of flashy word. And they may experience growth just fine, right? We see many examples of this all the time. You may be someone who For instance, like my brother, my middle brother has had a six pack since he was 8 years old, right? So it's like he could do any ab exercise in the world, and someone could look at him from the outside and be like, "Damn, those are some effective exercises." Not that he hasn't grown; he has. If he's listening, Dan, love you. But so there's just all these different kinds of things that I think muddy the water insofar as talking about this generally. But the second answer, with that context sort of in mind of like, where's this person in their training career? What have they done? What have they not done? And by the way, one other thing to add is someone may be training for a very long period of time, 10 years, whatever, 5 years, 10 years. And they may be training relatively hard, but maybe they're just totally neglecting a specific category of motion, right? Like I can't tell you the number of people that are just neglecting, we'll say, lengthened work for the middle delts, right? Everyone is doing dumbbell lateral raises their whole life, right? And the second they maybe start to now introduce this novel stimulus, this kind of stimulus that they've never achieved before, someone may, because that's a novel situation, even though they're experience growth at a level that is disproportionate to, on the outside, how long they've been training. So that's kind of answer one, which is the annoying context. And then the more practical settings, or the more practical points that I would have to say about that are, number one, again, just starting with a goal. If I have a particular goal, I need to kind of understand the basic things in relationship to anatomy and physics that I need to train a muscle, right? So I mentioned the middle delts. Well, most people know that like raising your arm kind of up and out to the side is like, that's kind of a middle delt thing, right? And most people know that doing a pull down motion is probably not a middle delt thing, right? So you arrive at a very general framework for like the technique, as we discussed earlier, which is, in the context of this middle delt thing, am I raising my arm out to the side, and do I have a resistance that is trying to sort of pull me in the opposite direction? So that's step one, is you need to have the very basic boxes of the anatomy and the physics checked. And I think that's something that a lot of people take for granted right now, especially that the fitness industry is sort of off and running, although it's a relatively newer industry compared to other industries. It's not super well researched like a lot of industries are. People take for granted the fact that they can just walk into a gym and there are 100 pieces of equipment, all of which do very specific things, because we've established these very basic things around anatomy and physics, right? Even a bench press, right? People don't really think about the fact that someone had to come up with the idea to create a piece of equipment, which was like a bench, and then to invent a barbell, which we can use to press off of our chest, right? We all just look at that and we think chest, right? Or we think triceps or whatever. So once we have those sort of anatomy, physics boxes checked, I think the next layer of things to kind of look at relate to the concept of stability, right? And when I say stability, I don't mean like the flashy sort of smoke bomb term that has become stability in the industry. I really just mean like, are you in a scenario which would allow you to make your target muscle the main thing that is working in this exercise? So take the dumbbell lateral raise and ask someone to do a lateral raise standing on the ground versus standing on a Bosu pole, right? Would there be, or balancing on one leg, right? You see a lot of like celebrity workout videos where people are like balancing on a single leg on top of an unstable surface trying to do this other thing. Those would be situations in which I would say, okay, these things are maybe checking the very basic anatomy and physics boxes, but they're kind of missing the more specific application of what might be most beneficial or most stable. And the exercises that I call stable are the exercises in which I can definitely guarantee, or at least I can come as close as possible to guaranteeing, that whatever muscle you're trying to train, you can make that thing do the most amount of work relative to any other muscle within the context of a set, right? So this is very easy to do in the context of a bench press. It's very easy to do in the context of a pull down, very easy to do in the context of a leg extension or a leg curl, whatever it happens to be. And certain muscle groups, like the middle delts, for example, are maybe inherently a little bit more complicated, or certain muscles like the biceps and the triceps, maybe a little bit more complicated in terms of how we can make those motions more stable. But overall, I would say as long as you've checked those three boxes, you got the anatomy, you got the physics, and then you got the stability. Those three things, those three major buckets are kind of the big things that I look at, and all of them relate back to the specific goal, right? And then what you're trying to make the limiting factor of a given motion in relationship to that goal.
Yeah, I've just written down here limiting factor and then stabilized movement. Again, very, very detailed answer. Here's me thinking you would mention mechanical tension and progressive overload. Yeah, it's very complex. It's good. It's good to hear. It's awesome.
And I'll just follow that up because you mentioned it. All of these like more nuanced things, like for example, mechanical tension, progressive overload, right? Maybe that's not super nuanced, but it's certainly a layer deeper than the things I just discussed. All of those things need to come as like second, third, fourth order consequences of the main stuff. It's like, okay, we can talk about all of the theory based stuff that we want, but if we don't have the very simple boxes checked, it's like those things to me are irrelevant outside of that context. Doesn't mean that they're not important to understand and they can't sort of give people the additional percentage points that they're looking for in terms of the progress that they might want to see, especially at more advanced levels, right? But I do really like that concept of what are you making a limiting factor, because that doesn't just apply to exercise, right? If you ask someone in the context of nutrition, for example, so maybe someone is struggling to lose weight, or maybe they're struggling to gain weight, you can ask a very simple question, which is, what do you think is holding you back, right? So, for a large majority of people, it could be food quality, right? Maybe they're just eating crap all day. It could be sleep. It could be that they're drinking 5 nights a week, right? And they refuse to decrease the amount that they're drinking and the total amount of calories that they're intaking, right? And so we oftentimes jump to the more nuanced things, like what supplements are you taking, or are you getting your morning sunlight, or are you taking the right dosage of omega-3s versus omega-6s, and all that stuff is important. But I do find that people are sort of jumping way ahead because those things, at least on the surface, appear to be these quicker fixes. They appear to be these things that are magnified in terms of their importance, I think, relative to how important they actually are. And I think that the same thing happens in exercise when we all sort of start to like mentally masturbate and talk about these really, really nuanced things that may be, again, important, but just not outside of having those initial boxes sort of checked.
Do you think stimulus to fatigue ratio comes in with the whole limiting factor? So choosing an exercise which obviously gives lots of stimulus, but very low fatigue.
Yeah, I certainly think it's a variable that should be considered, but I do think that if you, and let me know if this makes sense, because I'm not sure that it will. I think that if you appropriately apply the anatomy, the physics, and the stability concepts, the whole stimulus to fatigue thing is kind of like something that is just par for the course, where it's kind of like this thing that is just built in or sort of baked into the cake of all these different exercises. And when we look at each of the exercises at a finer level, we might be able to say certain things about the stimulus that you're receiving relative to the fatigue that you're receiving. But ultimately, I think that if you are being specific and calculated about what you're trying to do given a goal, I almost think that the whole stimulus to fatigue thing becomes irrelevant, not in principle, but just in terms of like talking about it. So let me give you an example. If someone is, we'll say, trying to train their glutes, okay, and they have 2 options in front of them. And one option is for them to do a really well-built machine kickback, right? Super stable. Limiting factor per this person's perception is just their glute max. It's like their glutes are on fire, fat pump, awesome. And then option number 2, and I'm sort of going to avoid talking about the more minor nuances in terms of like which positions of the muscle this is training and whatnot. But option number 2 maybe is a deadlift, right? One might say, okay, per unit of glute stimulus, the deadlift comes with a lot more fatigue, right, compared to the glute kickback. And really what we mean by that is that the deadlift is a lot less specific to just the glute tissues. What we mean is, in a deadlift, I have involvement of my quads or my hamstrings, depending on what knee position you use. I have involvement from my erectors and my abs, right, to stabilize the trunk. I have involvement potentially at the shoulders and the shoulder girdle from holding the bar. I have involvement at my grip, right, and my forearms, right? So when we say that there's a poor stimulus to fatigue ratio, what we really mean is that we're not being super specific about the way that we're doing something or the way that we're executing something relative to the goal. So if the goal now was instead of just glutes, would choosing a glute kickback be a good way to train both my glutes and my erectors? Probably not. Right. So in that context, we could say, well, the deadlift has a decent stimulus to fatigue ratio because I'm training the glutes and I'm training the erectors in one exercise together. So that whole conversation, when I say it's sort of baked into the cake, I just really mean that if you've identified a goal and you're choosing an exercise that's appropriate to that goal, that conversation kind of becomes less relevant to me when you've clearly identified all of the moving parts within an exercise and you've defined what exactly you're trying to get out of it to begin with.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes perfect sense. So you touched on it briefly, I think on the last question about standardization and making sure the rep is looking the same every single time. How important do you think is standardization in a workout or in a given set when it comes to muscle growth?
So again, I'll just address sort of the frame, which is that I think that it's always important, but I think how much of an importance it plays is really relative to where a person is coming from and really what your goals are insofar as like um, pushing effort with an activity, right? So if you, for example, we'll take the client that I mentioned earlier who was in his early 20s, never lifted before. Um, Standardization in terms of the technique rep to rep is going to be less important probably for a person like that relative to someone who is dealing with much higher relative loads or much higher absolute loads in a given motion, right? Because the stronger that you get, the more muscle that you put on, the more weight that you're lifting, the higher the downsides for messing a particular thing up are, right? And that just applies to every single domain of life, right? The more high stakes activities that you're involved in, whether it's money or whether it's growing muscle and exercise, the more that the sort of downsides can also escalate or also be magnified as a consequence. So it's interesting because when someone is initially learning a specific motion, you want to teach that motion in a way which is relatively standardized, but which isn't too rigid to where you're kind of forcing someone to do something that they're maybe not super comfortable with. And so much of this stuff, to be honest, in both cases, to me, just comes down to knowing sort of what you're trying to do and being able to set up an exercise appropriately to that. So, for example, if I'm trying to get that beginner client to do a rowing motion, right? We're training upper back, we're training lats, some elbow flexor stuff, right? Am I going to put that person in a scenario maybe like with a bent over barbell row where they have 10 other things to manage in addition to the management of what they're trying to do? Or if I have an option to maybe choose a chest supported row where I decrease the amount of movement options that I have, and where this person can maybe just repeat the same thing over and over and over again with less sort of deviation and less potential risk for other things to become limiters. Now, all of a sudden, you're putting that person in a scenario where the likelihood of standardization is much higher because they have fewer things to manage. So in one instance, it's kind of like, well, I'll just say again that I think standardization is important, but I think that it scales in terms of its importance with a level of advancement and strength and hypertrophy. And when someone is initially learning movements, or when someone's kind of in an intermediate stage, I think it's more important to sort of set that person up for success and be okay with a little bit more wiggle room and to be okay with a little bit more technical deviation, because you are trying to, again, to our discussion earlier, you're trying to get this person to balance a focus on technique and a focus on effort. And if you're really sacrificing one or the other at the other's expense, that's probably not a particularly good thing to do in the initial phases of learning. You don't want to sort of move too far in one direction. But again, if you're on the IFBB Pro stage and you weigh 280 pounds and you are a sub 5% body fat, it's likely that you've checked all those other boxes of effort, and you probably need to focus a little bit more on the precise nature of each rep so that you can be a little bit more precise about how you progress, really how you're able to progress as a consequence of that, and how you're able to track things. So the more important that tracking becomes, the more important that standardization becomes, much like with diet and much like with nutrition. It's kind of like, if you don't sort of first start to standardize things, then you have no idea really where you are in space. So I think it's important for everyone, but as with these other kinds of themes, or these other kinds of questions, the similar theme is like, well, how much it depends is clearly based on where someone is currently at and what they're currently struggling, with.
So we're kind of allowing the gym user some sort of leeway in terms of technique, just so they can get the extra 2, 3, 4 maybe effective reps out.
Yeah, and I've seen it. Um, far too many times be really problematic, where someone is perfectly healthy and they're perfectly capable of undergoing a little bit of a deviation in technique. And like I said, depending on the exercise that you're doing, how much a technical deviation matters will change. Like, technical deviation on a max effort deadlift is probably more consequential than technical deviation on a biceps curl. But I do think that I've seen more often than not people just zooming in on one of those two things, standardization or effort, right, at the expense of the other. And I think if there's anything to take away from that, it's just to kind of continue to attempt to strike that balance, which can be difficult, right, without this sort of perspective of another person looking in at you. It's difficult to really know exactly what to look for, especially if you're not someone who is educated in this stuff. It's kind of like you're just looking at a blank piece of paper with no information, right? So I think that personal education in fitness is a really big thing for most people, at least at a very low kind of threshold. And I think that, as a general rule, if people can just find motions that they're comfortable with, that's probably at the end of the day the most important thing. And as long as they're, progressing in load over time, it's probably not a bad sign, at least for that person.
What do you think is the importance of challenging a muscle through both the stretched and shortened positions?
So I think at some point in, we'll say, we'll apply this in the context of like a training week, right? Because oftentimes we look at this at a very exercise specific level, but oftentimes when we have that conversation, we forget that like we can do more than one exercise, right? So it's kind of like that question of, should you do this or should you do that? It's like, well, it's not really, you have the time in the week to probably do two different kinds of curls, right? Even within the same session. So I think as a general rule of thumb, it is likely not a bad idea, assuming that this person has no kinds of joint pains, joint discomforts, muscular issues, connective tissue issues, recovery issues, whatever. I think it's likely a good idea to attempt to train the full length, the full contractile range of a given muscle throughout the course of a timeline. So that timeline could be a single workout. That timeline could be a mesocycle. It could be a week. It could be a microcycle. Depending on how you structure your microcycles, that could be anywhere from, 4 to 6 days. It could be within the context of a month. It could be within the context of two different programs that you're scaling on a longer timeline. So I think just at some point in your training, if you zoom out and we'll say now just a couple of months of training, it's probably important from an orthopedic standpoint. It's probably important from a muscular function standpoint. It's probably important from what we can call a longevity standpoint, to be able to train multiple different positions of the same muscle. So a good example of that might be the one that you mentioned, which is like, okay, if I'm doing a dumbbell curl where I'm just standing up, I'm doing a traditional dumbbell curl, a good example of that might be like, you're doing the top half of the curl, right? Only, and then maybe on another day you're doing the bottom half of a curl. Or you could extend that a little bit differently, and you could say, well, I'm going to do two different kinds of curls throughout the week. One of which is going to be a dumbbell curl where my arm is at my side and I'm going through the full range of excursion of that particular motion. And then on another day, maybe I'm going to train a preacher curl where my shoulder is in a little bit of a different position and where the muscle length of the biceps is altered as a consequence. And I'm also going to go through the full range of elbow motion. So we kind of have different things to talk about here, one of which is the range of motion of the joint in question, which the joint in question would be the elbow and the shoulder in the case of a curl primarily. And then another thing would be the length of the muscle, right? Because you can train a specific length of a muscle within one position, but then you can also change that position and train, and this only applies to biarticular or two joint muscles, by the way. And then you could go into a different position and train a different length. So it really depends on sort of what, in terms of just the specific examples that we're drawing on, it depends on what you're talking about in terms of, are you discussing muscle length, or are you discussing range of the joint, or are you trying to sort of talk about both simultaneously? Because those are different things, and that can get quite complicated if you haven't heard this before. So I'll sort of give a simplified version of that, which would be, within the context of a week, a couple weeks, a month, it's likely that you'll want to train more than one position or more than one exercise for any given muscle group. And that, to me, really comes down to this idea of variability and just differentiation of stress, so that you can train similar qualities and you can train the same muscles just in a slightly different position or with a slightly different amount of resistance in different positions of that exercise, so that over the long term, you're not sort of double, triple dipping into the same bucket of stress, and so that you can start to differentiate these things. A very concrete, simple example of this would simply just be like, imagine that you're watching TV, okay, and you're binging, I don't know, the latest Netflix series that comes out, right? Let's imagine that you're sitting there for 3 hours, a lot of episodes, okay, whatever. It's likely that at some point you are going to shift the way that you're sitting, right, in the seat. And it's likely that this happens unconsciously. So the idea here, in terms of my perspective on training different muscle lengths, is basically just the equivalent of, we probably don't want to sit in the exact same position for 3 hours when we're watching our show. We probably want to shift the stress in terms of where it's aligning in our spine, where it's aligning in our hips, so that we don't sort of start to get uncomfortable in any one position. So much in the same way that you alter the way that you're sitting when you're watching a show, you kind of alter the position that you're training of the muscle. And, to be more specific than that would require, a dissection of each muscle and, how the physics relates to that. But hopefully that was a good sort of parallel to kind of paint the picture of just, you want to sort of achieve those different positions throughout a certain time frame, so that you don't sort of overstress the same pattern as a consequence of that.
Absolutely, yeah. So I guess to summarize, it's very important to take each rep through the full passive range of movement as much as you can, essentially.
Yeah, and I don't think, in a blanket sort of a way, we can say that everyone needs to train the full length all of the time. But I do think that if you have the ability to vary your exercise selection just a little bit from session to session, whether it be, again, on a weekly basis or a monthly basis, whatever, that's probably a net positive. And you kind of see how that's how most high level advanced, trainees, right? People with well-built physiques, bodybuilders, you kind of see that play out in most people's programs. Like, you don't see, Phil Heath, for example, only doing overhead extensions for the triceps, right? You see him doing the overhead extension, the one at the side, maybe a triceps press, right? And I think that at an unconscious level for those kinds of guys, maybe at a conscious level, right, the idea is just, we're training the same qualities in a slightly different way, so that we don't overstress that one tissue. And I think, again, that the most practical way to sort of apply that is just within the context of a week, right? So if you're training arms twice a week, you have your arm exercises for day one. Maybe you have a biceps curl with a dumbbell and an overhead extension. And then on day two, maybe 3 or 4 days later in the week, you have just a rope extension, right, with your arms at your sides instead of the overhead extension. And then maybe you have, a cable preacher curl with your arms sort of in front of you instead of at your side. I think that's a good way to sort of make that concrete for people.
What are your thoughts on length and partials?
I think that the whole length and partials thing is currently the rave. It's currently popular to discuss, because it's kind of like the new flashy thing, right? It's just like shiny object syndrome. right? You buy that new supplement, you buy that new product, and it's like, it's all you can think about, right? This also happens with like video games. For anyone that plays video games, it's like the first week that you play the video game is like, oh, couldn't be better. You know, the second week it's like, okay, it's still really good, but not as good, right? And so on and so forth with time. So I think that currently the pendulum is swinging in the industry really far in that direction. But I think something that's worth noting is that this is not like by any means in practice, this is not a new thing, right? Like people, I keep bringing up names of bodybuilders, but like if you look at the way that bodybuilders in the 90s even trained, and probably earlier than that, all of them at some point in their training are doing length and partials. And to me, the length and partial conversation right now in terms of like, is lengthened work, you know, on average, does it seem to be more hypertrophic than shortened work? Well, yeah, on a one-to-one sort of like look at this study scale, it seems to be the case, but there are all kinds of caveats that need to be made, such as like, what is the population of these studies that are being trained? They're mostly untrained people. Where are these people coming from in terms of what they've done before, right? So I think it's just another tool to add to the tool belt. And I think that where science communicators are going wrong is in only talking about the length and partial stuff and just sort of tossing everything else, you know, to the curb and saying that, you know, through implication, not even necessarily explicitly, but if it's all you talk about for 3 months, people are going to start to think that the other stuff is not so important. So to me, it's just like, it's a technique. It's a strategy to use per our discussion we just had, it's a strategy to use to train the more lengthened end of the range of a muscle, right? Assuming you have resistance there, which a lot of people who are doing these kinds of motions don't actually have the physics sort of aligned with their goal, but that's maybe a tangent. And so much like any other kind of strategy, I think that it's useful and it can check a box, but it certainly should not be, at least in my estimation, the only strategy that you should use. And I think that when you start to hyper focus, just like all these other things we're talking about, when you start to hyper focus too much on any one thing without, you know, sort of zooming out and taking a couple steps back to contextualize these things, I think that's where we start to run into problems. So to just be concrete with that, if all you do is length and partial work, then it's highly likely that you're probably going to at some point start to run into some kind of orthopedic stress just because of the fact that that's the only thing that you're doing. It doesn't mean that that's the thing that caused it, but the way that you went about that application was such that you basically just dug yourself into this length and partial hole without remembering to sort of come up for air and address other areas that you may not have been.
You can't really go wrong with doing the basics well, can you? If you just focus on the basics, do them well for a long time, you're going to get pretty good results.
Yeah, and you know that is always something that is said in the context of like talking about anything that is even minorly nuanced, and I think that it's not wrong, but I think, you know, if you ask anyone like, what do you define as the basics, right? The basics are usually people, whenever I ask people that question, they usually will start to list out like specific exercises. And then you ask one more follow up, which is like, why is that the basics? Like why is that the conclusion that you've come to? And a vast majority of the time, I think it's just a consequence of what people have been told are the basics rather than actually thinking critically about like, well, why are these things important and why do I need to check these boxes, right? Because one person may consider something basic that another person may consider, you know, overly nuanced, and another person may think the opposite about the same two things. So yes, I think it's true. You know, do the basics and do them for a long time, but there's clearly a lot of like gray area in that discussion, and specifically in our ability to navigate that discussion as an industry, it's just a nightmare.
Yeah, totally. So when there are so many different opinions out there in terms of the correct way to train and how to move in terms of building muscles, like such as yourself, Coach Kassem, Dr. Pack, Paul Carter, is Mike Israel, to name a few, someone like myself or others who are researching this specific subject, how do we know who, I guess, to listen to and who to follow when there's so many different opinions out there? Because there are so many. Obviously, none of you guys are wrong. Like, you all know your stuff. How do we know who to listen to and who's right, who's wrong, who's got the best opinion, who's, you know?
Yeah. So it's a great question. I think the first thing to address, and specifically for people who, because I feel for the person who is just confused, is like, man, this person is saying this thing and this person is saying the other thing. What do I do? I think the most important thing to do first is to try to eliminate the idea of right or wrong to begin with. Because much like the words good and bad, I think what that does is it takes something that is inherently very complex and it simplifies it down to a level that is convenient to simplify it down to for the sake of content creation. So I think the first thing that people need to do is they need to eliminate the words right and wrong from their vocabulary. And the second thing that people need to do is to constantly search for context, right? And so that's really the biggest pain in the ass thing to do in the world, because to identify a particular context is like, it's almost antithetical to social media, right? Like the whole purpose of social media is to make a single post, which is usually not contextualized, right? Just by nature of the beast, and then to make a specific point within 30 seconds, a minute, 90 seconds, whatever. So with those two things in mind, making sure to look for context, meaning when someone is communicating information, are they communicating it in a way which is contextualized? So if I said to you, dumbbell bicep curls are the best biceps exercise, or overhead triceps extensions are the best triceps exercise, that should be immediate red flag. Alarms should be going off, right? I made a bold claim, I said something in absolute, and I didn't provide any information other than that one statement. And if you look at 99.9% of content on social media, that's what people are doing, right? And so for me, you can't really do that super appropriately in the context of a video, but the caption exists. And so if people aren't using context and captions, red flag. So eliminate right or wrong and look for context. And then what I would say as a third major point is if you're consuming information primarily, let's say from 5 people, which I think is important. I think it's very important to take in different perspectives. Although it can be overwhelming, I think you're better off doing that than just hyper focusing on one specific thing and treating that as fact. When you consume information from those 5 different avenues, you should take in all the opinions. If you have to, write them down very briefly. Be like, okay, this person says this about this thing, this person says this. And then look for where the overlap is between people. Now, of course, there may be instances in which one person is just saying things that are objectively incorrect. So, for example, if someone says that a lat pull down is the best exercise that you can do for your chest, right, that can probably be, put to the side as something that is not particularly relevant, right? So, while there are those cases, generally speaking, for some of the names you mentioned, if all these people are saying things that are seemingly slightly different, look at all the statements together, look for the overlap. If there is overlap, that's probably where a decent answer is for you, given a particular context again. And if there doesn't seem to be overlap, what I would do is, let's say, in the context of a pull down, someone says, okay, doing a pull down this way will target the lats the best. And then another person says, no, but doing it with this arm path or this grip is actually best. And then a third person says, actually doing them 2 arms at the same time is best and doing them 1 arm is not, right? Try out each of those 3 strategies yourself and ask yourself which of these 3 things felt subjectively like it was most in line with what I was trying to do. I think that's something that is underrated as a strategy. I think a lot of us just naturally want the answers without actually having to do anything ourselves and without having to experiment. There's so much information now. It's like we're just information privileged. So I think that once you've sort of gone through the steps of looking for context, identifying obvious red flags in people being super confident in their communication, and then once you've looked for the overlap, then you can say, okay, if I've gone through those things and if I've checked those boxes, now let me try out each of these things for myself and don't give it just like the old college try, right? Do it for a couple of weeks, do it for a month, do it for a couple months, right? And then ask yourself genuinely, like, was this thing that this one person said more appropriate for me based on the subjective feedback, based on the objective metrics of how much, you think that you grew? And obviously there are so many confounders that go into that. But I think that as a strategy is not a bad strategy, because at least at the end of the day, even if you don't do any of the contextualization stuff and you don't really have any idea, what is rooted in fact and anatomy and physics and what isn't, you can at least at the end of that process be like, well, this thing just felt better for me. And so that's kind of where I'm going to go with it anyway. I think that should always be the priority for people who are just kind of looking to navigate this stuff on their own.
Yeah, I mean, there is so much stuff out there, isn't there? So it's no wonder so many people are so confused. The amount of questions I get about muscle growth and what the best exercise is for this and that. So yeah, it's no wonder people are just almost lost in a sea of social media information.
Yeah, and I think that it's even like just the way that we communicate this stuff is exactly what is wrong with this whole discussion to begin with, right? Like the very fact that we are having this discussion is evidence of the fact that people are communicating in a way that is polarizing and confusing, right? If we all, I think, attempted, and this is what I'm really trying to do more of, with my, social accounts now, is just to provide information and then to give a specific context and to say, if this is your goal, this is a solid option, try it out. It doesn't mean that you have to do it or you should do it. It means that this is the objective quality of this thing that I'm trying to describe, and what you do with it from that point is yours. I think a lot of people are not comfortable doing that because it makes it seem like, you're not intellectually competent or something like that, right? But I think it's just a lot of this like very insecure messaging of like, this is the way that things are and this is the way that you should do them. That to me is the most like anti-scientific, unproductive way to communicate. And the only reason I know that is because I used to communicate in a lot more of a polarizing way, and all I got in return was like negative feedback. And I was like, okay, like there's probably something to this large amount of negative feedback that I'm getting. Perhaps I should look at communicating in a little bit more of a nuanced, uncertain, contextualized manner. And that's not something that is sexy, but that's kind of like the whole game of social media, right? Is like figuring out how to make the unsexy sexy. And I think that it's okay to do that as long as you are being honest about what you know and what you can predict, as opposed to just pretending like you know everything, and pretending like you know what the outcome for this person you've never met, and never will actually be.
And I guess it's a case of just trying something, right? If you hear something on social media, give it a go. If it works well for you, if it feels good, then cool. If not, try something else. If you hear about 2, 3, 4 different things, try something one week, try the other thing a different week, for example.
Isn't it actually insane though how that is now a revolutionary concept?
Yeah.
It's like, oh my God, wait, I can try something for myself. Holy
Yeah.
crap, that is
Yeah.
crazy.
So this last question, I'm a bit conscious of your time, mate. So last question, this comes from your email, actually, your email you sent today about deadlifting, which I thought was a really good email, really interesting. So it's not necessarily bad or unsafe to deadlift with a flexed or rounded spine, right? So why do you think, A, that deadlifting with a rounded spine is sort of frowned upon, and B, why is it that most injuries occur from people who deadlift with a flexed spine, or is that not a case at all?
So I'll just start with the end there, which is I don't think that we have, at least we don't have any sort of empirical data, or at least any strong body of evidence to suggest that more people get hurt with spinal flexion, spinal bending as compared to the alternative. But we do certainly see that in practice, right? The injuries that we mostly see, at least, and again, it's so tough to simplify this down to that kind of a claim. But in my experience, I personally, clients, I tend to see back-related injuries occur in that sort of spinal flex position. So that's anecdote. That's not supported by literature, right? So that distinction is important to make. So the first thing to point out here is this concept of correlation and causation. And so for people who are not familiar with this concept, an example of when something is correlated versus when something is causative, or when something causes something else. I'll give a silly example. So when I come home from the city and I open the door, oftentimes my cats will come and greet me at the door, right? And I can assume that my walking through the door caused my cats to stand up and walk to the door, right? But there may be other reasons that my cats stand up and walk to the door. My perception is that they come up to me and they start chirping at me because they like me and because they're excited to see me, but it may actually just in fact be because they're hungry and they want food, which seems to be the case. Okay. And anyone with a cat probably knows that, right? So
Every time. Yeah.
silly example, right? But what I assume to be a cause of their coming up to me and chirping at me might not actually be a cause, but it could be correlated with the actual reason. So in the case of spinal rounding in a deadlift, we can sort of take the same perspective, right? So if we assume that most deadlift injuries that we see occur with a rounded spine, does that necessarily mean that the injury occurred because of the rounded spine? Or might there be other factors such as using more load than a particular tissue could tolerate, performing more volume than the individual could tolerate, not getting enough sleep the night prior, nutrition being off the night prior, the day prior, the day of, right? The concept just being that there are so many variables, so many inputs into this outcome that we see that we can't point to one single thing and say this was the cause. So a big takeaway from that newsletter, which by the way, if you're listening and you're not subscribed, subscribe to the newsletter. It's free. The big takeaway from that is just that we should be very careful to point to any single variable in any particular context and say, this is the thing, right? Because with any system, there are a multitude of inputs, many of which we're not even aware of that have an influence on the outcome. Okay. So now that we've established that, I think it's important to say that per the original question of like, is spinal flexion bad or is it good, right? I think by now, if people are still listening up to this point, they know that like I'm not a fan of that framing. So I think the helpful way to think about this is oftentimes when people load past their capacity to deadlift with a neutral spine, they end up starting to bend their spine for a couple of different reasons. We could say that it's the strength of the erectors relative to what I'm trying to do. We could simply say that, my foot pressure was off and so I shifted and so I needed to rebalance myself. We could say, that just based on how I was trying to accelerate the load, my leverages needed to be a little bit different, right? All different kinds of things. But the outcome that we observe is spine rounded, person got injured, right? And so the takeaway from that should be, I got injured. And that is the only takeaway that we know for certain, right? That's the only thing that we could be super confident about. So the conclusion from that should not be that rounding your spine is bad, because guess what? There are probably plenty of other times prior to that injury occurring that you also rounded your spine and that you did not get hurt doing. So a good example of this was I mentioned earlier that I used to do a little bit of powerlifting unofficially. And one of the things that I struggled with was tweaking my pec. Specifically, my right upper pec was always getting bothered, was always flaring up. It was that really knifey, like pinchy feeling that I would get, which is part of the reason, by the way, which I really started diving into all this mechanic stuff to begin with, because I kept getting hurt. But what I would do when I got hurt, because I would video all my sets like, typical powerlifters do, I would analyze the moment that I got injured and I would look at it and say, oh, this thing moved over here and that's why I got hurt. And so what I would try to do moving forward from that point was I would try to avoid that. But what I didn't realize is that I would scroll back several months, back in my camera roll, and I would look at all of the previous heavy bench presses I did. And what I noticed looking back on those things is that the exact same motion that I perceived to be bad in the context of the injury was also happening in the context where I wasn't getting injured. So was it just the fact that like my elbow flared out? Well, no, because my elbow flared out every other time that I hit a bench PR. And all of a sudden there's this one time where I get injured and I assume that it's the only thing. So the biggest takeaway is simply that something can occur and not necessarily be the only cause. It could be a cause, a influence, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that is the thing that was causal. And it does, again, to this whole conversation in general, we just need to be mindful of the fact that there are so many influences that play a role. So in the context now of talking about like, should you or should you not round during a deadlift, I would say, well, it depends on what you're on what you're trying to do with the deadlift, right? If your goal is to train muscles around your spine, it's probably not a bad idea to use a little bit of spinal motion where you need it. If your goals are to train the glutes, the adductor magnus, the hamstrings, the muscles that just or the quads, depending on how you do the deadlift, if your goals are just to train those muscles, you might say, okay, well, it makes more sense to try to keep my spine more rigid so that I can just train motion through these other joints. And as a consequence, I can just train length change through those other joints. So I want to say one more thing, but is that making sense to you so far?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, complete sense.
So then I would say, like, okay, well, if my goals are just specific to training muscles in my hips, does it make sense to begin with to train a movement that involves a lot of spinal extensor, right? Well, per our earlier conversation of the stimulus to fatigue thing, right? If my goals are also to train my erectors, it makes sense. Deadlift, cool. Deadlift will be this like really sort of generalized stimulus. There's a lot of erectors, probably a lot of glutes, a lot of hamstrings, adductors, whatever, potentially quads. Again, depending on how you do it. And the ratio of those things will change depending on how you do it. But if now you're in a scenario where you want all of those things apart from the erector stimulus, you don't want any like spine stuff really heavily involved. Well, does it even make sense to choose a deadlift in the first place, right? Assuming that someone, is not super attached to it and doesn't just love to do it. Because if you love to do it, that's a whole different story, right? So in the context then of like just wanting to train the hip stuff, well, I have a million other options. And if deadlifting is something that has historically bothered me repeatedly, it's probably a good idea to obviously look at like how you're doing it, how you're loading it, how you're progressing it. But it's also as important to look at other options that can do similar things without those same potential downsides of fatiguing the erectors significantly and without this super high skill demand of needing to manage my whole spine as I'm also managing stuff around my knees and my hips. So another option might be, well, instead of doing this thing, maybe I will, in the context of glute training, like I mentioned, maybe we'll do a kickback. Maybe in the context of just hamstrings, I'll do a leg curl. Maybe in the quads, I'll do a hack squat or a pendulum squat or a leg extension, right? You have a potentially limitless amount of different options from which to choose that if you're really struggling with a particular thing, you should not feel obligated to continue to do a thing just because someone on the internet said that it was a foundational movement and that you need to do it, right? You also don't even need to, and this is last thing I'll say, I promise, you also don't even need to do a deadlift in the way that we traditionally do deadlifts, right? So for example, I've had plenty of clients deadlift without any sense of spinal fatigue, just simply by raising the point off of the floor from which they begin the movement, right? So I'll put boxes under the weights. I will, just abbreviate the motion and tell them to stop earlier. That's a perfectly viable strategy. You can do the same exercise and just modify the exercise in a way that makes sense relative to your goal. And back to this whole, like, the arbitrary nature of this thing, like, why did someone decide to make the diameter of a 45-pound plate the diameter that it is, right? In some sense, it's completely arbitrary. And so our attempt to deadlift a plate off of the floor, right, is also arbitrary, right? There was no one reason to begin with that someone made a diameter of a plate that amount, at least not that I'm aware of. And even the person who first invented the 45-pound plate, which I should probably do some research to figure out who that was, even that person probably did not anticipate that the whole population would assume that now we need to pull this thing off of the floor, because maybe if they knew that that was going to be a thing that people would do, maybe they would have made the plates bigger. Maybe they would have made them smaller. Who the fuck knows, right? Hopefully I'm allowed to curse.
Yeah, it's fine.
So that's unfortunate because I've kind of been resisting the urge
You have.
to
You've
say,
been doing
to
very
say
well.
fuck this whole time. Okay. Now I can just really just hammer it toward the end here. So yeah, so that's kind of the summary of it in short, if you can believe that, in short, which is basically just to say that we really can't call motions, good or bad. and we can't call specific motions, specific joint actions good or bad. Much in the same way that we don't say that our elbow bending is bad, right? We shouldn't say that bending our spines, are bad. There's no way that we could even begin to try to answer that question in the context of research. Again, at a general level, right? Research really speaks to averages, right? And what people experience is always not an average thing, right? It's an individual thing. So I think those are kind of the main takeaways from that.
Interesting. I mean, it's so eye-opening. I used to be so almost obsessed with technique and making sure the technique was right, was correct. But as you said, I think the takeaway is there's no right or wrong. There's no good or bad when it comes to training and lifting weights. But no, it's been a really, really interesting, in-depth podcast, mate. So thank you very much for agreeing to come on and have a chat with me.
No, man, not at all. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I'm happy to do it again sometime. I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, good stuff with all the hard work you're doing. Keep it up. I'm sure you'll be inspiring others. Yeah, just keep doing what you're doing. That's what I'm going to say.
Thanks, man, and good luck with the course.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ben. Nice one. Cool. Yep. I'll speak to you again soon.
All right, Rich. Have a good one.
Nice one. Cheers, Ben.
See ya.